My name is Antoinette Colombo. I'm a third-year student and the chair of Women's Law Group. And we're very pleased to have this event here for you today.
My name is Molly Gray. I'm the co-chair of the International Law Society together with Nick Lowe, and just wanted to welcome everyone and also let you know that books will be available for sale after the talk. I have the pleasure of introducing President and Dean Mark Mahali, who's going to introduce our very distinguished speaker today.
Thank you, Antoinette and Molly and Nick. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's a really special pleasure to introduce Governor Kunin. Governor Kunin is a unique, absolutely unique national leader. She was the first female governor of Vermont and the first woman in the United States to serve 3 terms as a governor. She was a former Deputy Secretary of Education, and she was ambassador to Switzerland, so I could have introduced her as Ambassador Kunin instead of Governor Kunin, but this being Vermont, I think I would choose a more important title. She's also, I was going to say wife of John Hennessy, but I think I better say John Hennessy is her husband. John was the former dean of the Dartmouth Tuck School and acting provost at UVM, but more importantly, again, for 8 years a trustee of Vermont Law School. Interestingly, something you should know about Governor Kunin, because it's relevant, I think very relevant to where we are, is that Governor Kunin received a VLS honorary degree. However, she applied to VLS to be a student at VLS and couldn't come because we didn't have part-time options and she had children. So she has the honorary degree, but back then couldn't do the law degree. After being governor, she was the founder and the first chair of the Institute for Sustainable Communities, which is a really interesting international nonprofit in Montpelier, but you may not know was incubated here at Vermont Law School. And she appointed the first woman, Denise Johnson, to the Vermont Supreme Court and brought many women into positions of power in her gubernatorial administration. She continues to work on issues of gender equality, including this year's new equal pay law. And she's a writer on these topics. This is the book, The New Feminist Agenda, which is I urge you to look inside and think about buying it. It's broader, and it doesn't just have what you might think in a book with this title. And Governor Kunin has offered to increase the value of the books beyond their face price by signing them afterwards. So you might think about that. And the Women's Law Group is happy to take your cash. I don't know, credit cards?
No credit card yet.
Interestingly, this was your second book? Third book. This is the 4th, right? Her 4th book, We Do, is another book I recommend, which is American Leaders Who Believe in Marriage Equality. And it's a series of speeches and portraits. An interesting book. So it's a pleasure to have Governor Kunin here, and special thanks to the Women's Law Group for inviting Governor Kunin to come to Vermont Law School for a most interesting talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dean Mahali, and delighted to be here. And it's kind of special. You know, Molly introduced the introducer. Oh, thank you. This is not a secret message from NSA. I was asking earlier what the percentage of women students were at the law school, and it's an important statistic, 55.6%, which is a long way from when I, as a mother of 4 young children, came down here to apply for law school. But as I started to say, Molly was my student at UVM, and in the class I taught about women in politics, and obviously she's a star, and I'm delighted to see her here, as well as to see so many women these days studying law. I have to confess that when I was in college, I didn't even know a female lawyer. It was just a very different world. So now you are all role models for each other. And the fact that there is a women's law group shows, where you are at this point in legal development or legal education. And I do feel very much at home here because, as the Dean mentioned, ISC, the Institute for Sustainable Communities, found its first home here, when Dean Costel was the dean. And actually, I received 2 honorary degrees. I'm about to hang up my shingle, but I may have to wait because the word honorary might throw off some customers. But the second one was with my husband, John Hennessy, and it was a wonderful partnership to be here for that celebration at commencement time. Well, I'm going to talk about the whole question of family and work, and how do you do it all? I mean, the very fact that I tried to do that, this was, I have to think about how old my youngest child is. This is about 41 years ago that I applied to the law school. And I thought, so many years later, it would all be kind of settled. We would not have to worry about how do I combine having a career and having a family. And how do I, make the most out of my education and really make a contribution to society? And I surmise that many of you are here for that purpose, and you're attracted to the area of environmental law for that very reason, because that's where you can have a huge social impact and political impact as well. Well, it's interesting that this year we have celebrated the 50th anniversary of Betty Friedan's Feminine Mystique, and I see some heads nodding. When it first came out 50 years ago, it's kind of shocking for someone my age to realize so much has happened 50 years ago, as we are also about to acknowledge the death of President John Kennedy 50 years ago. It seems like a milestone in history. Well, Betty Friedan changed the lives of people my age, and maybe she still has an impact for your age, I don't know. But what she basically said was, something's wrong in society. We have educated women. She was at Smith College at that time, and we're not using our education, and women need to be liberated. And the feminist movement took off. Interestingly enough, I belonged to a book group that year, and ever since I belonged to a book group of some sort or another, and we read The Feminine Mystique. And the discussion was very prescient in some ways, because people divided right down the middle. It was in my living room in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and one half the group said, this is terrible. She's demeaning us as mothers, as wives, and of course a lot of the women in Cambridge at that time were putting their husbands through school. And the other half said, hooray, somebody is saying it at long last. And you can pretty much guess which group I belong to. And it was an awakening. But Betty Friedan could not have predicted or even imagined what the women's movement means today, what gender equality means today. And, you know, I was interested in noting that Dean Mahali said the book is different on the inside than the title would predict on the outside, because he looked at the index. And I had a debate with my publisher whether to include the word feminist. I won't ask, but I'm tempted to ask how many of you like that word and how many of you do not. But it was toxic then for some, and it is still somewhat off-putting today. Though I'm proud to say that my husband freely identifies himself as a feminist, and men can be feminists as well. I suggest you marry one. But it, you know, was it off-putting or not? And today, when I meet with students, there's still, some say, I'm glad you used it. We've got to use it. We have to have the courage to use it. We've got to make it acceptable. And maybe there's a little resurgence of feminism. I don't care what you call it. The real issue is gender equality. And fast forward to today, what gender equality really means is political stability and economic prosperity. There is now information with strong statistics from the World Economic Forum, from the World Bank, from the United Nations that demonstrates that there is a direct correlation between the level of gender equality in the country and the level of political stability and economic growth. You can even take that one step further and say democracy. We cannot have a democratic country that subjugates women and minorities. So it's a much more expansive view of what feminism can be and should be. And there are charts and graphs that demonstrate this. And the World Economic Forum, when I was ambassador to Switzerland, I was invited to the World Economic Forum because it takes place in Davos, Switzerland. And this was in 1998, 97, and 99. And there were very few women there. Every once in a while I got excited about seeing more women until I found out they were all fur-bedecked, jewel-bedecked wives. There were women there on their own terms. For those of you who aren't familiar with Davos, it's where the elite meet. The elite politically, the elite economically, and where a lot of chatter goes on and a lot of deals are made. Well, today, the World Economic Forum has a gender index, a gender gap index, and it ranks countries in terms of gender equality. And what their criteria are economic participation and opportunity, education level, political involvement, political empowerment, and health. So those are the 4 criteria. Surprisingly, the United States, by the most recent ranking, ranks 23rd. We are not the country that has the greatest gender equality and the lowest gender gap. Klaus Schwab had a quote that says, well, I can't read my own writing. Oh, here it is. The lower the gender gap is directly correlated to high economic competitiveness. Now, there's an irony here, because that message has not gotten out to the American corporate world or American employers, and most certainly not to the United States Chamber of Commerce. Because the business community, with many wonderful exceptions, by and large, has opposed policies that would help close that gender gap. Policies such as family-friendly work policies that enable women and increasingly men to stay in the workplace if they also have families and feel conflicted. What am I talking about? Well, there are other ironies before I move on that one. You know, the countries where women are suppressed the most, such as the Middle East and Sub-Saharan Africa, they are also the poorest countries in the world. And the question is, when will they get it? When will they realize that the longer they suppress women's opportunity, most basically to get an education, they're really depriving themselves. So the feminist movement, born with Betty Friedan and other earlier feminists who spoke up about these issues, they really are not only suppressing women, they are suppressing their own families, their sons, as well as their daughters. But our challenge is how to get this message across. Because, you know, the answer always is, well, that's our religion, that's our culture. But we've said that about a lot of issues in the past. We have said that about segregation in the South. We have said this about gay same-sex couples' marriage in the past. And society has changed despite culture and tradition. So one of your challenges as you step out in the world after you leave Vermont Law School is how to do something that's pretty hard, right? Change the culture to make it not simply a women's movement, but a social justice movement, an economic movement, a political stability movement. So the United States, in the process of researching this book, I had some indications that we are different from the rest of the world, but not to the extent that I found out. And one of the impetus for writing this book was because I had written a previous book called Pearls, Politics, and Power, how to win office, about leadership, because ever since I was elected to the Vermont legislature, which was first in 1972, I've been promoting women in politics. And just recently, I founded, with the assistance of some legislators, a group organization called Emerge Vermont. It's to recruit and train women to run for office in Vermont at all levels. And so I've been encouraging the political participation of women, not only because I think it's a good idea, but because I think it does change the agenda. It does change priorities. You know, we know politics is competitive. You have to beat somebody else to get elected. But the agenda, the political agenda, whether it's at the state level, the national level, or the international level, is also competitive. You know, what gets to the top of the list and what remains a footnote? Well, in the United States, policies like paid family and medical leave, like early childhood education and affordable and quality childcare, like workplace flexibility, they are usually at the lower end of the list. Now, Barack Obama is making a strong pitch for early education, but the Congress, which seems to be, I don't know what the right word is, you'll probably fill it in for me, but totally incapacitated as far as action is concerned, is still not listening. Some states are. Now, why are policies like access to quality, affordable childcare so important? Why is workplace flexibility so important? And why is paid family and medical leave important? As you may know, we do have a law on the books for unpaid family and medical leave. You can take 3 months off after you've had a baby or somebody is ill without pay. The plus of this law is that you can't be fired for taking the time off. But even though that law is on the books, there's still cultural, somewhat disapproval of people actually using it. And not all businesses, you have to work for some firm that employs 50 people or more, not all businesses really promote it. And what it really, if we are to really make it equal in the workplace, fathers as well as mothers must take the time off. And that is what is happening in many Scandinavian countries. But why are these policies so important? Obviously, they're important for your own sense of equilibrium, that you don't have this constant stress between should I be home with my child or should I be at work. And you know, the book Lean In, I'm sure some of you have read it or at least heard about it. Lean In is interesting. It has started an important conversation, maybe not started, but brought it to new heights. But my quarrel with Sheryl Sandberg is one that she puts the responsibility for getting into a leadership position or being at the table and having a voice entirely on women. Women have to change, not the system. I would argue it is more the system, the way institutions are designed, the way work is designed, which still assumes that somebody is home to take care of grandma, to pick up your child from daycare. And I also have a quarrel, even though I admire much of what she says, that it is really looking at the top of the pyramid. And the women in top management and leadership usually can negotiate things. They have the power to say, can I take 5 months off? Can I come in 3 days instead of 2? Can I leave work at 4 to pick up my child? Or can I take half a day off to watch the school play? But women in middle income and lower income are more or less powerless unless you work for a company that allows that. So, we talk a lot about work-life balance, but I've decided it's a very difficult yoga position to actually get the right balance between work and life. So one of my messages to you is don't blame yourself. You know, I was talking to somebody the other day, she said, I've solved it. She isn't. She's a lawyer. She said, I get up at 4 o'clock in the morning, and then I can do my work at home at 4 o'clock in the morning. I can leave work at 3 in the afternoon to be home. I mean, women are doing all kinds of contortions to try to accommodate a dual demand to be both good caregivers and good providers. And 80% of families now, usually there's the sole single mother supporter or two-wage earner family. So the old Norman Rockwell, I realize you may not know who he is, but he was, he was the iconographer, if that's the right word, of ideal American life, where mom standing by the door wearing a pinafore, waving dad off to work, carrying his briefcase, and 2 perfect children on either side. But we know that they weren't so perfect, but that seemed to be the product of the ideal family. And today, either one woman goes off or 2, mother and father, go off to work. So we know that the world is different than it was as we had imagined it. But the workplace has been frozen in place. The workplace has not adjusted to the new family. And if it did adjust, and some do, as I say, there's a group called Businesses for Social Responsibility. They're active in Vermont. They supported a bill that was the Equal Pay Bill in Vermont, led by women. They are supporting a bill that is going to be taken up again for paid sick days, but the chamber is not. The chamber continues to oppose these bills because they say it is too expensive. There's another reason. As you know, we're going through a deeper chasm than ever between opposing views, not only between the Tea Party and Democrats, but also between, what is the role of government? What is the role of the private sector? And business, as a rule, does not like government to intervene. So it is a combination of the economic argument and the political argument. We want to be on our own. Well, these issues are important for several reasons, not only for personal making your life better and easier. They help reduce the level of child poverty in the United States. One of the most disturbing statistics is that the United States of America has the highest child poverty rate of any developed country. It is at 22%. Sweden, for contrast, is at 3%. I met someone from Sweden and at one of my talks, and she said, well, we're embarrassed to have a 3% poverty rate. I wish we in the United States were embarrassed to have a 22% poverty rate. We don't really see it. It's not like when you go to India where people are shocked when they see children begging in the streets. We don't see children begging in the streets. But we do have these figures that tell us how many children go hungry in America, how many children go hungry in Vermont. And it is often a hidden statistic. How do these policies affect that? By enabling women and men who want to be caregivers to stay in the workplace and collect a paycheck. The best anti-poverty program is still a paycheck. So many women, I was talking to a Japanese woman yesterday, and in Japan, it's a given that when you get married and your husband makes a better salary, you quit. If you haven't quit then when you have your first baby, you for sure quit. Well, we're better than Japan about the percentage of women in the workforce. But what we now realize is a lot of people quit when they have their first child, or they work a very limited part-time schedule. Interestingly, in Japan, they are beginning to get very worried about this because their fertility rate is very low. They're not going to replace themselves. It's 3.6 fertility rate in Japan. And that's been the incentive in some other countries. France and Germany have much better policies than we do. In France, you have something called the École Maternelle, which provides free childcare, sliding scale childcare, high quality, and 95% of French families use it. In France and Germany are still recovering from the losses they had in World Wars I and II. So it's an incentive. In Japan, they are looking for ways to make it easier for women to have children and stay in the workforce because their decline is going to be precipitous if they continue at this present rate. We don't have fertility incentive, but we do have the workforce incentive. And somebody objected the other day, said, feminism shouldn't have an economic frame. That's kind of getting away from the true passion and justice cause. Well, of course, the fundamental is equal justice. But unequal justice, just like gender inequality, has economic consequences because we cannot have enough productivity if more women, even in the United States, if women were in the workforce at the same percentage of men, I came across this statistic recently, we would have a 5% growth in GDP. So, it's not rocket science. When a woman works in developing countries, she can pull that family out of poverty. And when women work in developing countries and in emerging markets, their earnings go to children's education. Their earnings are spent somewhat differently. So it's a win-win situation. So why is it so hard in the United States to get these policies enacted? Well, just to give you an example of how different we are, the United States is one of 3 countries in the world, I'm talking about developing and developed countries, that does not have a national policy of paid maternity leave. We are in the cohort with Papua New Guinea and Swaziland. Those are the only 2 countries that do not have paid maternity leave, and the United States of America. Why is it so hard? There's a study committee that's been working over the summer to look at paid leave in Vermont. And as I said, they're paid 6 days pending, which is another important policy. Well, you can guess some of the reasons. Now, one that has been bruited about in the last campaign and it is still being used as a litmus test in some cases of people's patriotism is American exceptionalism. We are the greatest. Unfortunately, we are also the greatest in some areas that we would rather not be. We have the highest rate of incarceration in the United States of America. We have one of the highest rates of single parenthood. There are a lot of areas where it is somewhat embarrassing to be, depending how the chart is aligned, either at the top or the bottom. So the question is, what makes us that way? American exceptionalism tells us we're the greatest. We don't need to change. We are perfect. And it is considered unpatriotic to even hint at that. You know, so many people believe we have the greatest healthcare system. But we have a very high infant mortality rate when we are compared to other countries. But I won't go further on healthcare until it's fixed. I think it will be, and that we will have more access to healthcare, and that some of those statistics will change as a result. But the other is individualism. The whole, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. And I like to believe in that because when I was ambassador to Switzerland and I was born in Switzerland, I could feel the contrast. There's still more flexibility here. There's still more opportunity. But we are no longer #1 in upward mobility, which really surprised me. We're like 5 or 6 or 7. Canada, up the road, is better in upward mobility, however it is measured. But, I'm a product of the American dream. I came to this country as a child with my mother and brother from Switzerland at the outbreak of World War II, because my mother believed, one, that Jews in Switzerland were not safe, being surrounded by Nazi-occupied countries, and that there was more opportunity for her children. And she did inculcate us with a phrase that many immigrant children have heard over the generations: anything is possible in America. So I believe in that. But I also recognize it's not possible for anyone and for everyone anymore. And that opportunity has to be available. And sometimes you don't need to be supported, as you are in a socialist country like Sweden, entirely by government supports. But there is a place for government. And I had a conversation the other day. The concept of children is different in some of these other countries. Somebody put it to me quite bluntly. I think she was from Denmark, and she said, "We see the children as our future." Well, everybody says that, but they don't actually do it. Most political speeches end with that, saying, "We must do this for our children and our grandchildren." But they don't pay attention to their children and grandchildren in the ways that makes them our children, not just your children. It's a society, social responsibility to do that. And going back to the economics, we know pretty much what happens to poor children in America. We don't have to do more studies. We know that if you have bad nutrition, you don't have the same brain development. We know that if you grow up poor, you are more likely to drop out of high school. We know that as a high school dropout, your chances of being employed are almost zilch. We know that poor Americans are more likely to be incarcerated. We also have some information now about prevention. Not prevention at the age of 18 or 21 or even 16, prevention at birth. We know that if we provide good care, you can turn things around. There are 2 studies that were done some time ago of high-quality child care, which the care enrolled very poor African-American children. And, with Head Start, there have been studies and studies. Some people say it changes lives, other people say it doesn't really. And because you may have high-quality child care, but you go to the regular school system and there's drop-off or fade out. But what they now know is there are 2 types of learning. One is math and reading and the rest. The other is emotional learning. And the brain is affected deeply and almost irrevocably by how the brain develops at that time. To learn skills such as how to finish a task, how to focus, how to work with others, how to socialize. And those are the skills that last a lifetime. They went back 40 years later, one is called the preschool, and interviewed these adults who'd been in that preschool and compared them to a group that hadn't. And they found real differences. Lower incarceration rates, higher employment rates, less divorces. It was different. Not 100% different, but different. So we know if we invest the money in early childhood education, we can have a much better chance of breaking the cycle of poverty. And this is not only promoted by the usual suspects who would promote these policies. Women, child care workers, social workers. It is promoted by a Nobel Prize winning economist at the University of Chicago by the name of James Heckman. James Heckman has done studies, and I can't understand the numbers, but you can Google him and get some of the basics, that it pays, that $1 invested in early education brings back at least $7 in return. And it is much more effective than remedial work, much more effective than trying to rescue somebody after they've already been a dropout. Doesn't mean we stop trying to rescue, but if we really want to invest properly, that's where we should go. But again, some of these reforms are stymied by the sense that it costs too much money. Interestingly enough, Oklahoma has recently been in the news, and I've talked to people from Oklahoma writing this book. Oklahoma is a pretty red state, but Oklahoma has enacted a law that provides preschool for everybody. So it need not be a red-blue issue. And governors are catching on more quickly than the Congress. And in Vermont, Governor Shumlin is promoting early education, and legislators are stepping up to come to a question of money. It always does. But every time the United States has expanded social services, it's been very controversial. Medicare and Medicaid were extremely controversial. Today, very few people would retreat on Medicare and Medicaid. Social Security was controversial. It won by 1 vote, and in the next election, there was a campaign to repeal it. Now you can't even touch Social Security without a hue and cry from AARP. and everybody in that category. The GI Bill of Rights. How many of you know what it is? Well, I better explain it. Definitely an age difference here. GI Bill of Rights was enacted after World War II, and it gave every returning veteran money to have a college education and spending money, help pay mortgages, help pay expenses. They had to pull in somebody on a stretcher to cast the final vote because they said, it's too expensive. We just finished a war, we're in debt. How do you expect us to have this program? And besides, not everybody is qualified to go to college. College was an elite experience. But lo and behold, the GI Bill of Rights, which was very expensive and a very new idea, everybody has reached the consensus it created the American middle class. We would not be where we are today without the GI Bill. So, can you draw a parallel to today? Yes, of course, with the healthcare debate, we have to settle down. But I would argue that we will not maintain a middle class. We will not be able to lift children out of the cycle of poverty unless we invest in childcare, early education, and these policies. It is a question of economic future and economic security. One person I interviewed said she supports these policies because who's going to pay my Social Security? If we don't have enough earners, we'll never have enough in the Social Security pool. So how do you create that change? Well, I'll go back to where I started. One area is to elect more women. Will it make a difference? You know, whenever I say that, somebody, at least in the older age group, says, what about Margaret Thatcher? What about Golda Meir? They were tough women. They were not feminists, even though deep down I suspect they were, but they never talked about it. But we've had a couple of recent experiences. One is in the United States Senate. For the first time, there are 5 women on the Senate Armed Services Committee. There are 20 women in the Senate. You may have heard of anybody here from New York? Kirsten Gillibrand. Kirsten Gillibrand has led the charge on sexual assault in the military. Now, this didn't happen the day before yesterday when Kirsten spoke out and proposed legislation. Sexual assault has been going on in the military ever since there was a military, no doubt. But now it is on the front page. It is on the front page because those 5 women have made it an issue. They've changed the agenda. They brought in witnesses to tell their stories. They made it personal and real. And something is going to happen as a result of those women being there. Why? Because women still have somewhat different life experiences. There's not a woman in this room who hasn't walked into a parking lot late at night looking for her car keys and feeling a little tinge of fear. That fear cannot be experienced with the same intensity by a man. Now, men can support us, and luckily they do. Men helped pass laws which created rape crisis centers and other programs for abuse. But often it's the women who are there to lead the charge because of their experiences. And we just hit a milestone in Vermont. A few days ago, Governor Shumlin appointed a woman in the House to fill a vacant seat. And that changed the statistics. We now have 49 to 47 women in the Democratic caucus of the Vermont legislature. I was asked, what difference can it make? Well, again, go back to the Senate for a better, more dramatic example. Susan Collins, a Republican senator, led the initiative that led to the final agonizing compromise of the shutdown and the debt ceiling. She was first, and 3 other three other Republican women. Susan Collins is from Maine, Lisa Murkowski from Alaska, and the senator from New Hampshire, Kelly Ayotte, right, escaped my mind. But they, and Murkowski had a great quote. She said, it's time to get real. Politics be damned. Well, that's what had to happen. Maybe it's the lower level of testosterone. But I think women are more open to compromise. Besides, they actually talk to each other, which is rare in Washington these days. I mean, senators don't eat in the Senate dining room with each other anymore. These women have a lunch or dinner together once a month across party lines. They work on some bills together. I mean, that's what it should be like. But they had to set an example. They had to be out there first. And they were less terrified that somebody would run against them on the right if they compromised at all. Compromise has become a dirty word. Compromise is the art of politics, and it is how democracy functions. So I think having more women, we don't all wear halos. Sometimes I'm tempted. But we do, you know, we don't all have to agree, you know. There is Michelle Bachmann. There is, you know, Sarah Palin. And they have a right to be there. I mean, it'd be crazy to think all women are going to be to the left of center. So you shouldn't, but even if the needle moves a little bit, it affects the outcome. You don't need everybody to vote the same way. And having more women, having more voices, and the women can speak with authenticity from their life experience. And authenticity is important in politics because we see so little of it and our eyes light up when we do recognize it. So in addition to electing more women, I think we have to do two things, which is hard to do two things at the same time. We have to go back in the fight to protect what we thought in my generation we had. Access to safe and legal abortion. For goodness sakes, access to contraception. I never thought that would be a battle in the healthcare law. So people of my generation can't sit back and say it's all done, I can relax. I can't relax. That's partly why I'm here. But we also have to forge ahead because we cannot accept the status quo. We cannot accept 22% of child poverty in the richest country in the world. We should be marching in the streets on these issues. And we have to form coalitions. It's no longer just a women's issue. It's a men's issue. It's an elderly issue. It's a disability issue to be able to be both a provider and a caregiver. So we have to somehow find our pathway to more bipartisanship and to win back the old Republican Party. You know, most of the environmental laws, for those of you here in Vermont, were enacted by Republicans. There were Republican senators and legislators who really were in the forefront. And James Jeffrey was a leader. And Robert Stafford, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, was Republican. So I think the Republicans are beginning to recognize the Tea Party is not their best brand. But hopefully they'll shift and elect others who don't think it's disloyal to work across party lines. But let me conclude with a PowerPoint. I know you've been expecting one. What's a lecture without it? But this is a virtual PowerPoint. Before I give you the PowerPoint, I have to give you my favorite line. We've got to be at the tables where the decisions are being made. Women and men who share our priorities have to be at the table. Because if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. Think about that. And you know, it's clever, but it's also accurate. Your voice has to be there. You have to be where the decisions are being made. So what do you do to get there? What do you do to not only be at the table, but to change the menu so that the menu includes the issues I've been talking about? Well, my PowerPoint consists of 3 boxes. And in the 3 boxes, I try to answer the question, what makes you an activist? What makes you an activist? You know, Angela Davis recently spoke at UVM yesterday, and I heard her. She was, you know, activist, large, read large. Now she's a nice, middle-aged woman, still active, but not in a radical way. So you can be radically active, or you can be just a person who says, I want to see something change. So the first box is something called anger. You have to be mad about something. It could be, you know, the traffic on your street. There's not much traffic here. But think of where you come from. It can be something local, or it can be, why aren't they paying attention to global climate change? You can just be uneasy, upset about the way the world is. Then you move to the second box, anger. Move to the second box, imagination. Allow yourself to imagine change. You first have to visualize it, to work for it. And one of the things that Angela Davis said yesterday was not only your own imagination, but collective imagination. Collective imagination starts revolutions. But within that box of imagination, there's also another ingredient which I think is equally important, and that is empathy. To really walk, as all religions teach, in somebody else's shoes. So it's not just about you, it's about the society, the community, the street that you live on. Okay, first box, anger. Second box, imagination and empathy. The third box may be the hardest of all, particularly in the political times we live in. And that is optimism. To believe that if you stick your neck out, whether it's a Thanksgiving dinner when you argue with Uncle Joe, or whether it's before a Senate committee, or whether you're giving a speech at the law school, it's risky to stick your neck out. But it is only by doing so and believing that it's worth it, that it's worth the risk. It's certainly risky to run for a public office. You don't know what's going to happen, and you will be attacked. But I tell you, you know, the young people who sat at drugstore soda counters during the civil rights era and risked their very lives, they didn't know that they would be desegregating the South, that all those blacks only and whites only signs would be torn down as a result of their brave actions. You don't know whether it will work, but you do know that if you do nothing, nothing will happen. And that's the choice, you know, it's not a perfect choice. The government does not always respond. Society does not always agree. But probably the most dramatic social and legal change we've had in your lifetime began a little early, about 40 years ago, Stonewall, was same-sex marriage. You know, people thought, that's never going to happen. I mean, 40 years ago, somebody would have been considered really bizarre proposing such a social change. But society has changed. And it's changed for a number of reasons. One is gay and lesbian men and women came out. They were no longer in the closet. They had the courage to come out. So we knew them as people, not as gays or lesbians, or not as statistics. And we recognized them. You know, in Vermont, the civil union law passed in large part because one legislator, Bill Lippert, who was respected by his colleagues, publicly identified himself and gave a speech on the floor of the House. So it is possible to create change that would reduce poverty, create greater gender opportunity, greater work opportunity in the United States of America. And the fundamental impetus is still social justice. But we have to have the courage to speak. And I believe, as my mother believed, even with all the pessimistic statistics, I'm still an optimist. And I still believe that anything is possible in America. Thank you.
We'll take a couple of minutes for questions. I know some people might have a 2:10 class, but we'll do about 5 to 10 minutes of questions, and then we'll have our books and we'll have a book signing. So go ahead if anyone has any questions for Ms. Kunin.
Or announcements.
Or announcements or comments or...
I have a question. Earlier this week, maybe it was last week, the New York Times came out with this really short video. I think it was like an editorial video, and it was about women in law firms. And the first thing I thought when I saw the video was women really, really tired. Like they kind of went back to women that they'd interviewed 12 years earlier, and they're law firms in the country. And just talking about how they managed working at family, and then it closed, and it was kind of like sort of an uplifting video with the fact that there's only 4% of large law firms in the country, like the biggest, most successful firms, are headed by women. So pretty depressing statistic. And I guess for women entering the legal field, do you think that the challenge is different? And if so, how do we adapt to that challenge?
Well, I think you may know more. I just know statistics. Women partners in law firms, I think, are 17% at last I looked, which is a similar trajectory. To be at the top, to be in leadership, is very demanding of women and men. And one of the culprits, which has been discussed a lot, is hours, billing, the billing method. And so, my son works in a law firm where that is the case. But there is another law firm in Burlington that has a number of women, doesn't bill the same way, and has more women partners. It's sort of catch-22. You need more women in leadership to get more women in leadership. I was talking yesterday at the lunch table with someone, with a man from the geography department at UVM, and he's a person of color, and he said there are only 2 men in the geography department, and the rest are women. And he has a 14-month-old baby, and he stays home 2 days a week, works from home, and he says, they're great about it. They say, sure, do what you need to do. So because it's headed by women, they have wonderful policy. There was an era in the 60s when there were all women law firms in the 70s were founded just for that purpose, because they wanted to do it differently. I don't know the complete history, but I think it was hard for them to sustain it. I think there's still some left. And a friend of mine, who's a graduate of Harvard Law, actually wrote a book on it, and it was a problem from the get-go. So I think there has to be a different structure and different judgments about what makes a good lawyer. Is it just the hours, or is it the product? And of course, that's harder to do. But I would urge you, as you go out into the wide, wide world, to really propose these issues. Sometimes they don't even get discussed, because it is assumed that the status quo will always be the status quo. Again, I had an interesting dinner table, I guess, yesterday. I didn't know it would provide me all this fodder for. But there was a woman at the table who was chief negotiator for the union at UVM, representing the faculty. And I said, have you ever brought up the issue, do you just bargain about wages and benefits? And she said, yes. I said, well, have you ever thought of bargaining about childcare? I mean, her light went on. I mean, it's really a visible light bulb. And she said, I never thought of that. You know, that's what we should put on the table. Access to childcare or childcare benefits, or, you know, a menu that includes cafeteria-style benefits. So I think you have to ask. You know, these things aren't going to happen. And I'm beyond asking, demand. Yeah.
Just a comment, and I guess.
Oh, I never say that.
I know, because I have a question at the end of it. One of the things that, you know, when we talk about women in the workplace and whether they should be in the workplace or at home, this kind of Ozzie and Harriet, should Harriet leave home? One of the things that we face today is that women don't really have that choice. To have the same kind of home that you had back in the time of Ozzie and Harriet is no longer an option unless mom and dad are working.
Right.
And we haven't adjusted to that in terms of what's happening with the family, with two little kids on each side, when mom and dad leave. So I don't know, you were kind of starting down that path earlier in your conversation in terms of this difficulty in balancing. And I'd like to hear some more of your thoughts on that.
Just how
It's really not an option.
Right.
It's how we live today. It's how we have to live
That's
today.
right. That's right.
And
the economics have changed.
the economics have changed, and yet that lag that you're talking about is still there, so we have this problem with the two little kids, not in the home structure that existed at the time.
No, so you're absolutely right. All expenses have gone up. And the expectations of what is a middle class life have gone up. So it has changed. You know, one view of this issue is that African American women, poor women, have always worked. You know, nobody made an issue out of it. It became a subject of intense scrutiny when middle and upper income women started to enter the workplace. So it's different than it used to be. But the fact is, for most women, it is not an option whether to work or not. It's an economic necessity. You know, we read a lot about women who opt out of top jobs, and how do they get back in? That's still a very small percentage of women who either can afford it or want to do it. Most women have to work, not for what we used to call pin money, but for essentials. Remember pin money? Whatever that was, but it was non-essentials, not to put food on the table. Well, I'll close right now, but thank you. You've been a great audience, and you're going to make a difference in this world.
Thank you all for coming. If you're interested, please check out the book. It's amazing. And we thank you so much for coming.
Thank you.